is often horrifying. In that single terrible moment, hundreds of lives can be lost. For many, this danger preys on the mind every time they fly. Yet air travel is now our safest mode of transportation. The modern airliner is designed, tested, and built to protect its human cargo. This is the story of how scientists have crashed and burned their way through some of the most sensational experiments in the history of crash testing to try and ensure your next flight is a safe one. Flying has become a part of everyday life. 1.5 billion people travel by plane every year. To meet this demand, designers and engineers are building a new generation of bigger, better airplanes, capable of flying more people than ever before. At Airbus Industries, they've just built the largest passenger plane, the Airbus A380, capable of flying a maximum of 850 passengers. Inside, there's room for 10 squash courts. The fuel capacity is equivalent to 21 road tankers, and the takeoff weight is 560 tons, heavier than a 10-car passenger train. Impressive specifications, and at the heart of the design of this Titan of the skies is an unshakable commitment to safety.
We have an obligation to make sure that we've done everything possible to design, to manufacture, and to support in operations the safest aircraft possible.
Today's planes are safer thanks to decades of work in the field of crash science. Over the years, pioneers in engineering and safety innovation have crashed millions of dollars worth of aircraft. And they've even experimented on themselves to find new ways to save life. Each step along the way, their results have been fed into the design and construction of newer, safer aircraft. It's taken just over 100 years to get from this to this. The progress crash scientists have made possible is nothing short of remarkable. Some of the greatest advances have been in the robustness of the plane itself. Our very first airplanes were flimsy contraptions, built to fly, but not to withstand a crash. 1903 marked a new era in travel when the Wright brothers successfully completed the first powered flight. But within 5 years, aviation had claimed its first victim. Orville Wright, together with a passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, were conducting a flight test on a new aircraft. In a tight turn 45 meters up, the propeller broke and Wright lost control. The plane plunged to the ground. In the devastating impact, Lieutenant Selfridge was killed and Wright himself was seriously injured. It was a tragic illustration of how early aircraft offered frighteningly little protection in an accident. Stunts at the time revealed the effect of vertical impact on an early plane. Even a shortfall is utterly devastating. The wooden structure simply folds in on itself as the plane hits the ground. In this case, the occupant walks away alive, but few air crash victims were this lucky. The early days of commercial air travel had a poor safety record. The same accident rate today, with so many more people flying, would put fatal crashes in the thousands.
Watch out! Get out of there! She's ablaze! A funeral pyre fed by 1,000 gallons of gas!
But safety has improved so much that on a commercial flight today, you stand only a 1 in 2.5 million chance of being in a fatal crash. Despite the superb safety record of the modern airliner, most passengers would still admit to a leap of faith by trusting a cigar-shaped tube with wings to keep them in the air. Crucial to all safe flight is the aerodynamic performance of the aircraft, as aeronautics expert Professor Jeff Jupp explains.
The modern jet transport aircraft, of course, is a very large aircraft, a very heavy object, which has got to be got into the air and stay there. The wings are specially curved so that the air speeds up above the wing and, relatively speaking, slow down below the wing. There's a fundamental law in aerodynamics that as air speeds up, its pressure falls, its pressure is reduced, or equivalently, as it slows down, its pressure is increased. So what we have is a reduction of pressure above the wing and an increase of pressure below the wing, and that pressure difference provides the lift that keeps the aircraft in the air. You can feel it actually if you were just to hold your hand at an angle in a strong wind, and you'll be able to feel the forces actually lifting your hand, which is equivalent to the way a wing lifts.
The modern airliner is extremely aerodynamic, but its design has been shaped by bitter lessons learned from the failures of the past. In 1953, the de Havilland Comet, the world's first commercial jet airliner, crashed during a routine flight. Shortly after takeoff from Calcutta, India, all contact with the plane was lost. Investigations concluded that it disintegrated in mid-air. 8 months later, the same thing happened again, soon after a departure from Rome. De Havilland realized they had a serious problem on their hands. But with the plane in hundreds of pieces and not a single survivor from either crash, they struggled to understand what had happened to the aircraft in its final moments. With no obvious explanation for why the plane had disintegrated, crash scientists turned to the basic laws of physics for help. To test the effects of pressure changes on a plane fuselage, they immediately put the Comet into a rigorous testing program. Submerging the fuselage in a giant tank of water, they recreated the pressure changes planes experienced during high-altitude flight to examine the effects on the structure. But even after extensive testing, there were no signs that pressurization was having any structural impact, and the Comet returned to service. Meanwhile, around-the-clock pressure testing continued. But just over 2 weeks later, disaster struck again. On the 8th of April 1954, another Comet aircraft broke up in mid-air shortly after takeoff. The wreckage plunging into the sea near the Italian island of Stromboli. No one survived. All Comets were immediately grounded, and crash scientists stepped up their efforts to solve the mystery. What followed has been called one of the most remarkable pieces of scientific detective work ever done. With the wreckage of the latest crash too deep to recover, scientists concentrated on evidence from the earlier crashes, subjecting it to detailed examination. Amongst the debris, scientists found a section of fuselage that bore the telltale signs of metal fatigue. It was a shocking discovery in an aircraft that was barely 2 years old. And the worst was yet to come. The aircraft that was still undergoing pressure tests ruptured, a 2-meter split appearing in its fuselage. At 9,000 meters, a rupture this big would have spelt disaster for an aircraft and its occupants. Professor Jeff Jupp explains how the disaster unfolded.
So for the aircraft to fly economically, it must climb to a very high altitude, typically 35,000 feet. And at that altitude, the pressure outside the aircraft is very low, far too low for the livelihood of the passengers. So inside the aircraft, inside the fuselage, the cabin pressure is kept such that the equivalent altitude that the passengers feel is either 8,000 feet or below.
At high altitude, the difference in air pressure between outside and inside the fuselage creates enormous pressure forces on the plane itself.
As the aircraft climbs, the pressure differential increases and the fuselage shell actually does expand. Then as it descends, then the pressure differential disappears once more and the fuselage contracts. So at every flight, the fuselage is expanding, contracting, rather like the skin of a balloon. And if a crack were to form, which would cause the fuselage to break, well, we all know what happens when you burst a balloon.
Crash scientists concluded that the destructive energy that tore the comet apart was equivalent to the explosion of a 220-kilo bomb. And it all started with a tiny crack at the corner of a window. The problem was, the corners of the square windows were weak points, and repeated pressure changes put them under immense stress. And the smallest tear could be all it took to destroy an entire aircraft. The solution was a simple design change, to turn the square windows into round ones. The Comet airliner was later redesigned and flew successfully. Crash science learned an important lesson, and commercial airliners today all have rounded windows. And another crucial lesson emerged from this episode in aviation history: the value of rigorous testing. The Comet's fatal design flaw was only discovered after 9,000 simulated flying hours. The testing of today's planes may be more high-tech, but the basic idea is still the same. Crash scientists recreate flight cycle after flight cycle to test a design to its absolute limit. At Airbus, the A380 testing regime took 2 years. Sections of the aircraft were put through 47,000 separate flight cycles, monitored by 6,000 sensors, as over 1,800 tons of steel test rig applied repeated pressure loads. The result is an incredibly robust structure made up of the latest fatigue-resistant materials. The most revolutionary of these is Glare, a glass and aluminium reinforced laminate, which is used in the upper fuselage of the aircraft. Alternating layers of aluminium and reinforced glass fiber make it especially resistant to corrosion and fatigue, making the aircraft fuselage strong and durable. But keeping the fuselage intact is only one element of safe flight. Just as crucial are the engines that power it. It is a triumph of highly durable and efficient engineering that gets 560 tons of Super Jumbo off the ground and maintains the safety of everyone on board. Surprisingly, the closer you are to the ground, the more important it is that your engines are working properly. Most air accidents take place during takeoff and landing.
Nav checks on the SIG-based mask going, number 2.
If a plane experiences an engine problem at high altitude, pilots often have time to diagnose the problem and take corrective action.
Check is 0, would you? Cancel. I just said locked.
But if an engine problem occurs during takeoff or landing, there is less time for correcting the problem. January 1982. In freezing weather conditions, a Florida-bound 737 jet takes off from the Washington National Airport in the United States. Within 30 seconds, the plane is in serious trouble, struggling to gain enough altitude. It fails, crashes into the 14th Street Bridge and the freezing Potomac River below. Despite heroic rescue attempts by the emergency services, all but 5 of the 79 people on board were killed. The official crash investigation attributed the disaster to pilot error. But their failure to get Florida Palm 90 into flight was due in part to the bad weather and the effect it had on the plane's engines. Vital sensors gave an incorrect reading of the engine power because ice had frozen onto them. As a consequence, the pilots never gave the engines full throttle, and the plane fell out of the sky. This disaster underlined the critical role the engine plays on takeoff. Manufacturers have turned to crash scientists to put the jet engine through extraordinary levels of testing. Rolls-Royce is one of the biggest manufacturers of jet engines in the world today. At its technical headquarters in Derby, England, the latest engines are put through their paces. Engineers prepare by fitting the engines with thousands of sensors to gather stress and performance data. Then they're tested in simulated extreme weather conditions. The engines are deluged with 33,000 gallons of water an hour to simulate the heaviest rain and hailstorms. Then they're temperature tested with searing heat and biting cold, simulating the worst conditions they'll have to confront in the air while maintaining power and thrust. This is the kind of environmental barrage that crash scientists must guarantee the engine can still fly through. But there's an even greater hazard faced by jet engines in flight. Bird strike. The effect of a direct hit on any part of an aircraft can be devastating. The cabin, wings, and control surfaces can all be severely damaged by feathers and hollow bones, leading to loss of control or engine power. The first part of an engine in the line of fire are its fan blades. These work just like regular propellers, turning at high speed to drive the plane forward, so it's crucial they stay intact. This gelatin mold, the same weight and density as an 8-pound bird, is fired at a single spinning fan blade, which mustn't break. Everything from single strikes to an entire flock are aimed at various parts of the engine fan. Critical performance data from these strike tests has been fed into the design of the latest Rolls-Royce engine technology, the Trent Wide Chord Fan Blade. These blades are designed to stay intact and keep working even in the event of a direct hit. But crash scientists still have to test to see what will happen in the unlikely event of a blade actually breaking off. In this test, a controlled explosion intentionally shears off a single blade. The sudden release of energy within the engine is enough to throw a medium-sized car 30 meters through the air. And it's absorbed in the form of harmless vibration through the outer casing. Such research has ensured that jet engines have developed an extraordinary level of reliability. Tough and durable, the jet engine is also remarkably simple. Professor Jupp again.
Well, it's almost two engines in one in a way, because first of all the air is drawn in through the front of the intake to a large fan, which is really a propeller. And like a propeller, it draws the air in and thrusts it out the back, and that provides most of the thrust propelling the aircraft forward. But some of the air is drawn through a basic jet engine behind the propeller. It's a process of suck, squeeze, bang, blow.
Suck. Air is first drawn into the front of the engine, where squeeze. It's compressed by a large fan housed in a cowling which forces the air backwards and compresses it to 40 times its normal state. Bang. This compressed air then enters a combustion chamber where fuel is injected into it and ignited. And blow. This generates heat, increasing the air pressure and the engine's total thrust. The jet engine is a reliable source of incredible power, helping planes to fly efficiently most of the time as our safest form of transportation. But planes do occasionally crash. When it all goes wrong, it's the job of crash science to make sure the plane can still protect the passenger. Rising to the challenge is William Waldock, a professor at the Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Arizona.
There's really three things that have to exist to make an accident survivable. First of these is the impact forces that reach the occupants have to remain within human tolerance. The second thing that has to happen, occupiable space has to be maintained throughout the entire impact sequence. We can't let the structure crush in on the occupant. We can't let the structure go away. We can't let that occupant be exposed to things that are going to hit them. And then the third thing that has to exist is the environment has to remain livable throughout the entire accident sequence and beyond.
Failing in any one of these three criteria can result in injury or death. The outcome of one particular crash highlighted the fine line that exists between a survivable accident and one that is fatal. 1989. British Midlands Flight 92 experiences engine problems mid-flight and diverts to the nearest airport for an emergency landing. This was a scenario that pilots train for, and landing with one engine should have been straightforward. But the pilots shut down their good engine by mistake. Without the altitude and time to take corrective action, they'd gone from an emergency to a disaster. Struggling to land what was now a 60-ton glider, they fail and hit an embankment alongside a busy road at nearly 200 kilometers an hour. With no fire breaking out after the crash, impact alone killed 47 of the 126 passengers and crew on board. So why does the force of impact cause such high casualties? Again, investigators turn to science for an answer. The energy acting on the body during an impact is called G-force. In everyday life, we only experience one G, the normal pull of gravity on the body. In an air crash, G-forces multiply, and this can be extremely dangerous. As greater G-force is applied to the body, its weight increases and internal organs experience greater pressure. But how much G-force can the human body take and survive? In assessing the human tolerance to sudden impact, crash scientists conducted remarkable and dangerous experiments. In the early 1950s, an Air Force doctor named Colonel John Stapp found himself on the fast track to becoming a leading pioneer in the science of human impact survival. Valuable data that is still used by crash scientists today. At the Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, John Stapp completed 29 rocket-powered sled deceleration experiments. The plan was to strap him in tight, accelerate him to high speed, and then bring him to a sudden stop to test the effects of sudden high-speed deceleration on the human body. It was a high-risk experiment, and no one knew if Stapp would survive.
Fire!
Riding a sled called Sonic Wind, which generated about 50,000 pounds of thrust, he hurtled down a 1.5-kilometer rail track, accelerating from 0 to 1,000 kilometers an hour in just 5 seconds. A water break stopped him in his tracks in less than 2 seconds. The severe jolt was like that felt by a driver crashing into a brick wall at nearly 200 kilometers an hour. He experienced a phenomenal force of 40 Gs, more than anything scientists thought humans could survive. This faster-than-a-bullet ride left Stapp temporarily blind. He burst nearly every capillary in his eyeballs. But surgeons discovered that Stapp's retinas hadn't detached. Within minutes, he could see some vague images. By the next day, his vision had returned more or less to normal. Despite taking part in these high-risk experiments, Stapp lived to be 89 and died peacefully in his sleep. But while Colonel Stapp's sled rides had demonstrated G-force survival levels far higher than believed possible, they and the British Midland crash at Kegworth revealed another crucial aspect of impact survival. The body might be able to withstand significant G-forces, but for how long? Aviation safety pioneer Harry Robertson explains.
The severity of an accident is not just the G-forces that are being generated or what's resisting them, like your arm or your neck or your head, but how long those Gs will last. We could put 500 Gs, for example, on your head for a fraction of a second, and you would hardly know that. But if it lasted for a half a second, you wouldn't be here today.
In the case of the British Midland disaster at Kegworth, it was not the force of sudden deceleration that caused such high casualties, but the effect it had on the passenger space within the aircraft. Professor Angus Wallace was one of the surgeons who operated on the survivors. He noticed a significant number of injuries to the legs, arms and heads caused by impact with the plane's interior fittings. It seems not only had the seating come away from the floor, but overhead lockers had also torn loose. Under the effect of G-force, these had turned into lethal projectiles. Experts believe that more people would have survived the crash at Kegworth had the interior fittings been more secure. Interviewed soon after about this crash, Professor Angus Wallace highlights the failures of the plane's design.
We have seen during the last 2 years a number of survivable air crashes, and it is clearly time for aircraft manufacturers to devote a little bit more time and thought to protecting the occupants if a crash were to occur.
One particular weak point was the seating. Valuable lessons were learned as a result of this crash. The latest aircraft are fitted with seats that can withstand a force of 16 Gs, as compared to the previous designs, which could only take 9. This means the chances of survival are improved if the cabin interior can withstand at least the same amount of G-force as the human body. However, as the structural integrity of planes improved, it soon became clear to scientists that there was a bigger killer at work in plane crashes. On average, flames, smoke, and toxic fumes were killing 3 out of every 4 people who had survived impact. Crash science was about to tackle this terrifying phenomenon. January 1974. A Boeing 707 with 101 passengers on board crashes while making a scheduled stop on the island of Pago Pago, part of American Samoa in the South Pacific. The night approach to the island runway with heavy winds and a brewing storm was a difficult one. This time, it ended in tragedy. Hitting the trees a kilometer short of the runway, the plane cut through the jungle vegetation for over 300 meters until it finally came to rest. All but 4 of those on board died. But this was a tragedy with a shocking twist. Investigators revealed that of the 101 passengers on board, all 97 who'd perished died not on impact, but as a result of the ensuing fire. The lethal problem of post-crash fire has plagued crash science since the early days of flight. They were victims of poor design, and even minor crashes turned deadly, as entangled pilots were burned alive. The rising death toll inspired Jerome Lederer, a US airmail aeronautical engineer, to take action. He devised a series of full-scale crash tests, enabling him to analyze the sequence of events during impact. In 1927, at McCook Field in Ohio, he launched the de Havilland DH-4 mailplanes at full power down a ramp into a brick wall. Filming these tests at high speed shows the crash in detail and reveals exactly how fuel lines are ruptured, spilling gasoline onto the hot engine and exhaust pipes, where it bursts into flame. So Lederer made a simple but highly effective design change. By lengthening these fuel pipes, they were less likely to be stretched to breaking point when the engine was wrenched to the side during impact. Without heavy fuel spillage, the chances of fire breaking out after a crash was significantly reduced, and the lives of many pilots saved. This was a first step for crash science in tackling the problem of deadly post-crash fire. But the larger the aircraft, the greater the fuel capacity, and the bigger the potential fire hazard. Crash scientists focused next on what was actually causing the fire, the fuel itself. Modern jet fuel is basically kerosene. If it's contained inside the fuel tanks of an airplane, it's stable and won't easily ignite. But in the event of a crash, when the fuel is likely to spill, it's a different story. The danger is the spilled fuel will vaporize or mist if the tanks are ruptured on impact. Because the plane is still in motion, fuel particles spilling from any hole in the tank will mix with oxygen in the outside air, making them highly volatile. This deadly mist of fuel can turn the whole area into a fireball. One of crash science's pioneers in analyzing the cause of these fires is Harry Robertson. He planned to find out what could be done to prevent this horrifying phenomenon. Together with his crash science team, they acquired a number of aircraft from civilian airlines and the US military, spending many hours getting them ready for the tests. At the Deer Valley Airport in Arizona, they set about a series of dramatic experiments.
During our test program, we crashed a DC-7 and we crashed a 1649 Super Constellation, two major airline aircraft.
Filming the test at high speed, between 250 and 1,000 frames per second, revealed every detail of the crash. Robertson and his team designed these tests to simulate the typical impact event during survivable takeoff and landing accidents, when fuel fires were the greatest hazard to passengers. Harry Robertson's experiments focused on ways to reduce this danger.
One of the approaches that has been used to try to reduce the fire hazard threat has been to figure out a way to get the fuel that will not burn. Or if it does burn in an accident, it doesn't burn very violently.
The team developed a theory. By changing the consistency of the fuel, making it thicker, it would be less likely to spill so rapidly from a ruptured tank.
What would that fuel do in an accident? Would it stay in chunks and cut down misting, which is a real big problem in fires, for example? Or would it spill at a slower rate?
The team used dyed water instead of fuel because they wanted to see clearly how the liquid spilled and dispersed. A fireball could obscure their view and destroy the evidence. The team filled the inboard left and right wing tanks with a thicker, viscous water colored red and yellow to simulate a thicker consistency fuel. The remaining two tanks contained ordinary water, a different color for each tank, to see how badly they were ruptured on impact. As the plane hits, the left wing is twisted up and breaks, releasing large quantities of blue water from its tanks. As the engines are wrenched and the propeller blades sheared off, feed lines which carry the fuel from the tanks are torn apart and the fuel ignites. Out of the wreckage, the crash scientists begin their post-mortem of events and discover what happened to the thicker water, representing the more viscous fuel. The slow-motion footage shows that the more viscous fuel does not mist to the same extent as the usual liquid form. As seen here, the red and yellow mist spread over a smaller area than the blue. But the success of the fuel's anti-misting properties was short-lived. On closer inspection, it appears the viscous liquid creates a different but equally horrific danger. It can spatter in small enough chunks that stick to surfaces, which if hot enough, can ignite. These early thicker fuels were clearly no solution. But they inspired Harry and the team to come up with a different approach to the same problem. If they couldn't stop the fuel from burning, they'd have to try and stop it from spilling. This meant designing a tank strong enough to contain the fuel in a crash, but still light enough for the plane to get off the ground. The solution was a tough tank, a cut and tear-resistant bladder formed by a flexible bag. Unlike the rigid tanks, however, they could withstand greater impact force for longer by flexing and deforming, rather than rupturing under sudden violent pressure and distortion. The crash scientists set up another crash test, with an aircraft containing two different kinds of tanks. One was the traditional rigid casing, built into the wing. The other was the bladder design. Sending the aircraft on the same collision course as before, they wait apprehensively for impact. The result is not what they'd hoped for. Both types of tanks rupture, and once again fuel and oil lines give way, and a fireball erupts. This plane doesn't even have full fuel tanks. In fact, just enough to run the test. The experiment highlights the severity and complexity of the problem. How do you prevent the wing fuel tanks in a large airliner from rupturing? And how do you contain the spillage in the event of a crash? In large airliners, the most efficient place to carry fuel is in the wings. But a large wing requires a thick metal skin, and when this breaks, even the toughest bladder tanks would be torn open. Harry and his team went on to solve the fuel spillage problem in smaller military aircraft. But the problem of fire persisted on larger commercial airliners. In 1985, one particular disaster highlighted the urgent need for a new approach. In Manchester, England, a plane carrying 131 holiday travellers caught fire just before takeoff. Firefighters were on the scene within minutes, but still 55 passengers died. Helen Muir, director of the Cranfield Institute for Safety in England, was determined to find out why so many people died.
An aircraft was taxiing down the runway and a fire occurred in one of the engines, which caused the kerosene to catch fire. Within 2 minutes, the smoke was in the cabin and the conditions within the cabin were non-survivable.
Tests following the Manchester disaster showed the full horror of what passengers faced. Some of the materials inside the plane would have started to give off toxic fumes, turning the fuselage into a deadly gas chamber inside 2 minutes. These toxic gases can also explode in what's called a flashover, resulting in deadly temperatures. Helen focused on what happened in the crucial minutes when there was still a chance of survival.
When we investigated the accident after it had happened, we knew that we had had 2 minutes with half the exits open, and still 55 people hadn't got out. So the question that was asked was, why was it when we tested the plane we could get everybody out when we really needed to? Sadly, we didn't.
This accident was, for crash scientists, a graphic illustration of the difference between a test and a real-life emergency. There were a number of factors that appeared to be affecting survival. The science of psychology was part of the explanation. By analyzing human behavior, scientists could predict how people react to an emergency. Helen Muir and her team started on some groundbreaking research to look at these phenomena in more depth.
The problem is, how do you design a test which is going to produce behavior like would occur in that emergency without actually terrorizing people or putting them at physical risk?
Helen and her team came up with an ingenious solution to motivate a mad scramble for the exits.
If I say to them, right, the first half of you on the aeroplane will immediately outside any door I open get a £5 note in your hand, what will happen? And I learned that people do extraordinary things for £5. I was amazed to find that when we'd run the first few experiments and we'd had people rushing to get out of the airplane to get these fivers, I showed the videos to some people who'd been on the Manchester aircraft and had survived the accident. They said, yeah, actually, that's just what it was like. Someone crushed me in my seat and went over me, and look, it's just happening there.
Helen Muir's research showed that when faced with a serious danger, some passengers develop a survival tunnel vision. They take extreme action at the expense of others, fighting to get out. Others may freeze up and not move at all, blocking crucial escape routes. The tests reveal that when flight attendants take control of the evacuation, more people will survive as they keep the flow of passengers moving, preventing bottlenecks. The Manchester disaster also inspired a number of improvements to aircraft design itself. The most significant were the installation of emergency floor lighting to help guide confused passengers toward the nearest exit, and the use of fire-resistant materials inside the cabin to reduce the deadly effects of fire and smoke. Both features helped make the difference between death and survival in accidents since.
The recent accident at Toronto has to some extent shown that a lot of the work which we've been doing in the past 2 decades is starting to be successful, because in that accident, the aircraft crash landed and the frame broke up, but there was a fire, and in that situation, all of the passengers and crew did survive.
Meanwhile, attempts to find a less flammable fuel continued, leading to the most spectacular crash test ever staged. In America, the Federal Aviation Authority and NASA set up a test site at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The plan: to crash a Boeing 720 with a payload of 73 crash test dummies and 34,000 litres of fuel on board. The primary objective was to test how this fuel, with a new additive called FM9, designed to suppress fire, would perform in a crash. In front of a large crowd of news reporters, the plane takes off and climbs to an altitude of just over 600 meters. Directed by remote control, a path is set for the aircraft to land on a specially prepared runway. Awaiting the Boeing 720 are a number of obstructions designed to tear into the wings at specific points and release the fuel load. As the plane comes in to land, the plan begins to go wrong. It drifts slightly off course. At an altitude of just 45 meters, scientists make a last-minute attempt to get the plane back onto their predetermined line of approach. But it's too late. The plane hits the ground at an angle. The left wing brakes on impact, and the fuel inside starts to pour out and ignites. The anti-misting fuel fails to perform as expected, turning the plane into a fireball and engulfing the fuselage. Though unplanned, the crash itself was far more realistic than intended. Few, if any, planes actually crash with their wings level. The real tragedy of this crash impact demonstration was the shattered hope of finding a crash-resistant fuel for the commercial airline industry. Failing to find a less volatile fuel made it imperative to find alternative methods to improve aircraft safety. So, crash science moved on, shifting its focus onto the prevention of airline crashes altogether. The majority of all commercial air crashes are due in some part to human error. Washington, Kegworth, Pago Pago, and in 1977, the worst aviation disaster, excluding ground fatalities, in history, when 2 747s crashed into each other on the runway of Los Roderos Airport on Tenerife in the Canary Islands. In heavy fog that had reduced visibility to just 300 meters, a KLM Dutch Airlines 747 had started to take off down a runway where a US Pan Am Jumbo was still taxiing. The total death toll was 583.
Nav checks on the 6 base mask going, number 2. Roger, clear.
The black box revealed the KLM captain was impatient to take off and had made decisions which led to the crash. The black box, or cockpit voice recorder, contained a unique record of the crew's conversations in the final moments of an accident-stricken flight. It's an invaluable source of information that allows crash scientists to retrace the decisions and sometimes the mistakes made just before the crash. In the case of the Tenerife runway disaster, the KLM pilot took off without final clearance. In the majority of cases, it's human error that seals the fate of the aircraft. And the role pilot error plays is one that crash science has tackled by using technology that protects the pilot from making the wrong decision. At Airbus Industries, they've developed a system called fly-by-wire, as Chief Test Pilot Peter Chandler explains.
Now, one of the advantages of the fly-by-wire is that where there are regimes of the flight envelope that we know that the pilot should never need to go into, will never need to go into, then we can add protections.
On the latest fly-by-wire aircraft, safe flight is guaranteed by computerized protection. On this aircraft, the pilot cannot take the plane into hazardous flight, because any attempt to fly outside of the aircraft's safe limits of angle and speed means the computer steps in and takes control.
Speed, speed, speed.
There's a warning to tell me that the speed is low. Now I'm in the protection.
Speed, speed, speed.
And now if I do nothing, even though I haven't moved the throttles, the engines have wound up to full power to try and speed me out of it.
But crucially, while this technology is designed to increase safety, it's not meant to replace the pilot altogether.
Whether we will ever get to a pilotless cockpit, I think it's not close at the moment. The way the whole aircraft operation, both the infrastructure from the ground side, the air traffic control is set up, means that you have to have the flexibility of somebody on the aircraft to make decisions.
Even after 100 years of the most impressive design and technological evolution, the airplane still relies on the skills and experience of the human pilot. And today's crash scientists consider that the way to make flight safer still is to combine the very best of man and machine. 1 in 8 travelers in the United States still say they avoid flying at all costs. But despite our fears, this really is the safest way to travel, thanks to the crash science industry dedicated to safety.
Today's airliners have achieved a level of safety that's unprecedented. Every year we move hundreds of millions of passengers safely around the world at levels of safety that are unachieved by any other mode of transportation.
Today's planes are modern scientific marvels, which make it possible for more and more people to do what man was never meant to do: to fly.